Welcome everyone to this week's BAA weekly webinar. As always, this is being recorded and also live streamed to YouTube. It's my great pleasure to welcome back Nick James, one of our regulars for the weekly webinars, this time a journey through the Comet section archives. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you, Andy. And yes, I was lucky enough to be the first presenter of these webinars all the way back on April the 1st, which seems like a huge amount of time ago, just after the lockdown had started. I never believed that we'd still be in this situation now in June. If you remember, that webinar that I gave on April the 1st was looking at the prospects for a comet called 2019 Y4 Atlas, and we made various predictions in that webinar, none of which turned out to be true. And one of the things about comets, and I say this regularly, is the only thing you can really predict about a comet is where it's going to go, so where it's going to be in its orbit. It's extremely difficult to predict anything about comets other than that. So trying to predict what they'll appear like in the sky, how long their tails will be, how bright they'll be, is really hard. So for this webinar, and photographs were all hard copy. So really up until probably the mid-90s, the vast majority of material that was received by the Comet Section Director was in terms of paper. So I remember quite distinctively meeting Jonathan in a car park in Northampton, where he drove in his car very, very low on its axles, and we transferred a huge amount of boxes, about 17 cardboard boxes worth of paper archives from his car to mine. And so mine went to effectively running on its with its suspension compressed and looking like it was massively overloaded. Luckily, the police didn't stop me on the way back home, and I unpacked all the boxes and started to go through them. So these are just some examples of those boxes, and within the boxes are folders, and there are generally folders for every particular comet. And the archives go back to the time of Merton, so just before the Second World War, so the late 1930s. Prior to that, the archives don't seem to exist, and I'm sure Richard McKim could probably say why that is, but I think the Comet Section has done pretty well in that we still have our archives back to the late 30s. But the thing about stuff being on paper and in boxes in the section director's house is that it's not particularly accessible. And so one of the things I wanted to do as director was to start going through this archive and digitize it, both to make the archive available to people, other people, but also to provide some degree of security that if for any reason the physical archives were damaged in the future, we would have digital copies. So that's what I've been doing with the help of other people. Dennis Brzezinski and Martin Mobley have been extremely important helpers in this process. So in terms of what we've got in the archive, we've got a lot of photographs, and this is just an example. And this is an example for probably one of the most photographed comets that we have in the archive, which is Comet Arend-Roland from 1957. We have loads and loads of photographic prints. We have lots of plates and films. So photographic prints are relatively easy if slow to scan. The plates and films are much more difficult, but the BAA Council has just recently invested in a film scanner for me. So I'm now starting to go through some of the films, and in terms of the plates, and large format films, we're photographing those off light tables. The other thing in the archive are all the letters, and there are some fascinating letters, and I'll show some of them today, going back to the late 30s. And we also have an innumerable number of report forms. So this is an example of a visual report form from 2002, I think it is. We have loads and loads of those. So they will have all been entered by the director, Jonathan Shanklin, at the time, but we keep the paper forms in case we need to do any later analysis. And so a lot of these forms have been scanned in. So any paper that's in a standard size like A4, we could scan in quite fast because commercial scanners will take big batches of those things and will scan them very cheaply. The problem is with stuff that's not in A4 format, like little postcards and smaller things and scraps of paper and things on airmail paper, which is extremely lightweight and very strange sizes. And so we've scanned most of the stuff that's on A4 and foolscap. Anyone who's old enough to remember foolscap, but a lot of the stuff that's on non-standard sizes we haven't. There was also a lot of stuff like this, actually, which in the end, we decided not to keep. So these are the IAU circulars. So these days, you get those by email. In the olden days, they came as postcards. And the Comment Section Archive included boxes and boxes of these. Now, most of these have been scanned and are online, have been done by the IAU. So we decided we wouldn't keep these, but we did keep a few. And this one's a particularly interesting one. This is the notification of the transfer of the IAU Central Bureau from Copenhagen to its current location at the Smithsonian in the US, in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So in terms of images, some of the earliest images we have are from the very accomplished and famous comet imager, Reginald Waterfield. This is an image of a comet, which again is quite famous because it's one of Leslie Peltier's comets. This is 1936 K1. And this is an example of the kind of images that comet photographers could get in the 1930s. And don't forget that these days, when we take images of comets, we generally do it by taking short exposures. We can then electronically stack the images to follow the comet. In Reggie Waterfield's day, that was not possible. You had a single exposure on a piece of film. You had to use your guide scope to track on the comet, or if the comet wasn't bright enough, you'd track on a star, and you would offset guide in order to remove the motion of the comet. It was an extremely hard and complex thing to do, but there were certain people who did it very well, and Waterfield's a particularly good example of that. One of the other things that we have in the archive, which I'm very grateful to Martin Mobley for having scanned, are Reggie Waterfield's notebooks. So we've got those going from the 30s all the way through to the 1960s. And it's very interesting to look at some of the images that we have, the scans of plates and films, and compare them with the notes in Reggie's notebook. Now, this is a bit of a cheat because this is for a different Comet Peltier. This is a Comet Peltier in 1939, but there are a number of cases where we can look at the notes in Reggie's notebook, and we can then look at the resulting picture that was taken, photograph that was taken, and that's one of the really nice things of a digital archive, is joining those things together. So just very quickly running through some of the interesting comets we have in the archive. This is a particularly interesting one. This is 1948 V1, it's now called, 1948L, it was called then. This was a comet that was actually discovered at a total eclipse. And sadly, we don't really have any decent copies of the picture of the comet at the total eclipse. This is about the best we've got. But what we do have in the archive is lots of memorabilia about this comet. So this was when Gerald Merton was director. So what we've got here is a newspaper cutting from a South African newspaper. This is actually the text from a BAA meeting where the person who was looking into it, because the picture was taken from an RAF aircraft. This is sort of part of the interesting thing about this, is trying to identify where that original eclipse image might be. I'd hoped that it might be in our archive, but so far we haven't found it, but people can sort of trace through various reports to maybe one day find this picture. What we do have, though, is pictures of it after the eclipse, when it was visible in a dark sky. And this is a rather nice set from Pretoria, showing the comet with a very nice tail. And I think comet pictures in particular look more impressive when they have some foreground. You get some idea of the scale. So often we'll see pictures of really spectacular comets, but no real idea of what the scale is. Whereas if you can see house roofs and fences and things in the foreground, it gives you a much better idea of how spectacular and how big the comet was. Now, it was 1948, just after the end of the Second World War. There were still a lot of people out in the British Empire, as it then was. And Merton received lots of reports from various people around the empire who sent their observations of this comet. And these are all in the archive. We've scanned them. These are some of the earliest files that we have in the archive. So around kind of the end of the Second World War onwards, the archive is pretty complete. So jumping forward a bit, I mentioned Aaron Rowland. Aaron Rowland is probably the most photographed comet that we have in the archive prior to the digital era, actually prior to Hale Bopp and Hyakutake. And this is a case where we can tie up an entry in Waterfield's notebook with the actual scanned plate that we also have in the archive. So this is a picture of Aaron Rowland taken on April the 30th, 1957, showing that it was a very, very nice comet. And Waterfield and others got excellent pictures of it, but one of the really nice things that I think is demonstrated by Aaron Rowland is just how different technology was in those days to now. So Waterfield did astrometry on the comet. So that's measuring its precise position. Now these days we can do astrometry with the click of a mouse using a program called Astrometrica. In those days it was much more difficult. Waterfield had to take the plate, he had to develop it, he put it on a light table, he then used a traveling microscope to measure the positions. He then manually got star reference positions from a catalogue, calculated the comet's position using a calculator, and that would be a mechanical calculator in 1957. And then these days we click a button and all of our astrometry, and it may be hundreds of positions we get a night, gets sent automatically to the Central Bureau in the US, and they have computers that process it, accept the astrometry, and effectively then can compute orbits. That's not how it used to work. This is an example of an astrometric measurement of Aaron Rowland by Waterfield, basically typed out and sent on a piece of paper, and then whoever received it would have had to enter that manually to calculate an orbit. But still, good orbits were produced, and astrometry was one of the key things that observers could do then. This is a rather nice letter, I think, from the archive. This is from a certain ACB Lovell, Bernard Lovell. This is Bernard Lovell before he was really that famous. This was May 1957. So this was something like 5 months before Sputnik 1 was launched, and 5 months before Lovell became famous because of Jodrell Bank and its ability to track Russian spacecraft. It was also during the period when Lovell was under a lot of stress because he was at that time, the radio telescope at Jodrell Bank was massively over budget, and he was personally responsible for a large amount of the debt. And I think it was only after the Sputnik 1 launch that Lord Nuffield called him and bailed him out. Anyway, this is a letter from Lovell to the director of the Comet section at the time, Merton. And I love how in the sort of style of the day, you address the letter to Dear Merton. So dear surname, but that's just how it was. And this is Bernard Lovell saying that they had a Schmidt telescope at Jodrell Bank, and they'd been taking some pictures of Aaron Rowland, but they didn't really know what to do with them. And he was asking the BAA Comet section director for advice on what to do with his comet images. In fact, at the end of the letter, you can see here, he's actually angling to get one of the people who's at Jodrell Bank, who's been involved in taking these images, to come and work under the supervision of an authority What do you think about this, and have you any suggestions to make? Unfortunately, there's no, I couldn't find any record of the response from Merton back to Lovell, but that would be interesting. But it's interesting to note that Bernard Lovell at this point, when he was about to become incredibly famous, was involved in comet imaging, and asking our director for advice on what to do with those images. There were some quite good comets, some very nice comets actually, in the last few years of 1957. This one is Comet Mirko, 1957D, and this is a particular a nice example of somebody who'd written to Miss Brown, who presumably was, I think, the secretary of the BAA at the time. Presumably it would have been forwarded to the Comet section director, asking for the identification of a possible comet that they'd seen in the night sky. Well, it actually turns out that that comet was this one. It's Comet Mirko, 1957D, as it was then. And here's another lovely Reggie Waterfield image of it, taken at the time, pretty much at the time that this person had seen it in the night sky. So it was in the days when information didn't flow as quickly as it does now. And essentially you could look up into the sky and suddenly see a comet like Comet Mirko come out of nowhere. Other nice things in the archive are these sort of postcards from foreign observers. So this is a really nice one from Italy, again showing Comet Mirko with a nice Italian stamp from 1957. And there's a letter from Brian Manning. So those of you who are old enough will know Brian Manning as a very accomplished astrophotographer. This is fairly early on. This is 1957, when again he's taken some images of or photographs of Mirko, and he's asking for advice about what to do with them. This is another fairly famous person in the BAA's history. This is Alfred Curtis, who's famous for setting up the Winchester meetings. And he was an observer too, and this is his comet report. And in this comet report, he mentions Comet Bennett, 1967I, 69I as it was then, which is a very nice comet seen by lots of people. And here's a Waterfield picture taken of it in 1970, April the 4th. So just a few days after Alfred Curtis had made his visual report. The Comet section started a monthly publication, or a quarterly publication, I think it was, in 1973, called Ostima and Stella, under the directorship of Stan Milbourne. And it was something which, when you read it now, and this is all online, if you want to go and read these things, you do realize just how incredibly different things were then to now. But one of the things that isn't different is people always want to predict comet magnitudes. And Ostima and Stella started in 1973. And so one of the first things it had in it were predictions actually by Harold Ridley of the projected light curve of Comet Kohoutek. Now, Comet Kohoutek was one of those comets which brightened up quite rapidly far away from the sun. And depending on the magnitude law that you took, it could get to some really spectacular brightness. Now, then as now, people in the know, like Harold Ridley, would have presented these light curves showing that there's a big variation in the brightness expected at perihelion. But the media, of course, would have just taken the brightest one. So it's going to be magnitude -10. And so everyone was rather disappointed, or at least many people were rather disappointed when it turned out not to be so bright. But in fact, it was a good comet. And this is a lovely sketch by George Alcock showing the comet in December 1973. But by January 1974, it was clear that it wasn't going to be as bright as people had hoped. And so the editorial in Ostima and Stella was basically, well, that's a bit of a shame, but it was still a very interesting comet. It was a comet that showed a lot of interesting features in it to those people who were keen comet observers. So a bit like the recent comets that we've had of Comet Atlas Y4 and 2020 F8 Swan, they may have disappointed the kind of general public because they would have believed what they read in the media. But for active comet observers, they were very interesting comets to observe. This is 1974. Just have a look at the list of observers here. Got some very famous names: George Alcock, of course, John Bortle, all sorts of very famous names of here, Harold Ridley, Reggie Waterfield, and others. So that's 1974. People were disappointed by Kohoutek, and so when the next bright comet came along, the media didn't really cover it very well. And that's odd, because Kohoutek wasn't really that bad. So these are two images of it, one on the left by Richard Miles from Bristol, the one on the right there by John Robertshaw from, I'm not sure where, but both of them are short exposures, so 15 seconds on Tri-X, and shows a nice tail. But the media had been burnt by this Comet of the Century thing, so they didn't really publicize the comet that was to follow. And that comet is a comet called Comet West. Now, Comet Kohoutek, because it was the Comet of the Century, received a lot of publicity, and there were even kind of flights with Patrick Moore on going up to watch it. But Comet West didn't receive very much publicity at all. And it turned out that Comet West was actually really spectacular, but it was spectacular in the morning sky for only a few days. It had a bit like our recent experience with Comet Atlas. It had the nucleus fragment. So it provided all sorts of interest to observers, but it wasn't seen by very many people in the UK. This is an example of a report sheet from our archive for Comet West, showing a few people observing it, but not that many. It was a spectacular comet, though, in the morning sky. This photograph on the left here was taken in Japan, but this drawing was done by a certain John Rogers in Cambridge. I don't know whatever became of him, but a really nice drawing showing a nice comet there in Delphinus. And Paul Doherty not only did drawings of things, he took photographs too, and here are some photographs of the Comet West that he took early in the morning sky. So you had to get up early in the morning. You see the time's about 4 to 5 UT in April. So Comet West was a really nice comet, but it came after Comet Kohoutek, so it didn't really get the publicity that it deserved. The next big thing, 1986, was Comet Halley. And again, this shows the amazing change in technology, because this is a report here of trying to recover Comet Halley using the 200-inch telescope at Palomar with a CCD at the prime focus, 1981, December the 18th. It was not found, and it says presumably fainter than 24th magnitude. So 24th magnitude sounds faint, but for a 5-meter telescope, 300-second exposure, it's not that faint now. But of course, Comet Halley was then picked up the following year in 1982, and became quite a big thing for observers to observe. There was the International Halley Watch here. And I was reading through that yesterday when I was putting this together, and I came across this nice little paragraph that people who are old enough may remember. Stephen James O'Mara reported seeing Halley with the naked eye, I think it was from Hawaii, when it was about 8th magnitude or something like that. And there was a lot of suspicion about whether he'd really seen it or not. So that was a big controversy, which is alluded to here. Also, some controversy over who was some of the early photographs amateurs had taken, and a photograph that had appeared in the Sky and Telescope in 1985 that it turned out had actually been retouched and rephotographed so that it could be reprinted, but that wasn't actually stated in the subject line. So quite a bit of controversy going on there. A lot of observations in the BAA archive of Halley, of course. There's a big Halley Comet memoir that we produced, but the comet itself wasn't particularly well seen from here, but it was very well seen from further south, and this lovely picture of it near the center of the Milky Way in Sagittarius. But of course, we didn't get to see that. It wasn't a particularly good apparition for us up in the Northern Hemisphere. I put this in because this is slightly out of order, but I put this in because it's one of the BAA member discoveries. So this is Roy Panther. This is from the archive. The thing on the left there is a display board from the BAA exhibition meeting when we used to have the exhibition meeting down in London, showing Roy Panther with the telescope that he used to discover his comet. The text on the right there is actually a bit of a cheat. It's from the Astronomer magazine, and it's part of Roy's discovery description. But again, in the archive, we've got lots of reported observations of Panther, but very few photographs of it. There are some, but they haven't been scanned yet, so I can't show you them, but they're not particularly spectacular. But here's some examples of observation reports. Roy Panther reporting on his own comet. That must be quite a thing to do, to actually make observations of your own comet, and also observations here by Mike Hendry. Moving more up to date, and I'm almost finished really, because I'm not going to go into the digital era. We're in the early 90s now, and things are beginning to start sort of moving as far as computers are concerned. And I was taken by this letter from Brian Marsden, who obviously was very famous as effectively the father of the IAU and orbit computation, to Stan Milbourne, our director, because both of them, Stan did a lot of orbit computation for the BAA. He produced material for the BAA circulars. And he programmed most of his orbit computations in a language called BASIC. And in fact, in our archive, we've got listings of Stan's BASIC program for doing comet orbits. And this is Brian Marsden encouraging Stan to move on to the much more advanced language of Fortran, which tells you a little bit about the kind of era that we're in. But Brian, there are lots of letters from Brian to Stan and others in the BAA. He was a great friend of the BAA, and it's really interesting to see the letters in our archive from him, because at that point he was an extremely important person in comet astronomy, but he had a great affection for the BAA and for amateur observers in particular. So he really encouraged amateur comet observers, which was really good. I mentioned earlier about astrometry being difficult in those days. This is actually in the 80s, where people had constructed their own measuring engines. This one is Edgar Everhart's measuring engine. This is from a letter that he sent to Mike Hendry in the early 80s. But essentially, you would take your films, put it on the light table there, measure the XY coordinates with this traveling microscope, turn the film around, measure it in the other direction. And then, at least by the 1980s, people had got computer programs that helped them with finding catalog stars and calculating the astrometry. Coming right up to date, well, right up to date as far as the paper archive is concerned, are the two comets in the mid-90s that are really the end of what I would say is the sort of paper era of the archives. Two comets discovered in consecutive years, Hale Bopp in 1995 and Hyakutake in 1996. Although it turned out that Hyakutake was the most spectacular earlier on, so it was at its best only a few months after it was discovered, whereas Hale Bopp was at its best 2 years after it was discovered. In this case, these are from the comet's tail. These are Jonathan Shanklin, and they both predict really good comets. And in these cases, they turned out to be correct. So this is what Hyakutake looked like. In my experience, actually the best comet I've ever seen. These are pictures that Martin Mobley, Glyn Marsh, and I took from Tenerife in March 1986, so only less than 2 months after the comet was discovered. And Hale Bopp, of course, which those of us who are old enough will remember, was just an extraordinary comet. It was around for months and really impressive in the sky. This is a Mike Henry image on film, large format film that he took from East Berkholt in Colchester. And Mike died a few years ago, and Richard McKim and myself managed to collect all of his archives. So I have all of his films and plates, and we hope to digitize those over the coming years. But again, that was a really impressive comet. Hale Bopp probably at the moment is the largest number of images we have of any comet before really the digital era really started. I have loads and loads of slides and photographic plates of Hale Bopp, which we are gradually working through now. And the BAA Council recently bought us a slide scanner, which means that we can actually go through and digitize some of those. And this is a really good example. This is a Joe Young picture, which we have in the archive as film, 35mm film. This is 2415 taken with a Schmidt camera. So really, really impressive stuff. And we will be gradually adding all of these images to the archive over the coming years and scanning more of the paper content of the archive. But I'm stopping here because I think after these two comets, things started very rapidly transitioning to digital media. So email was getting going in the mid 90s, and CCDs and digital imaging were getting going. And so very rapidly after the sort of middle 90s, the actual physical paper and film in the archive stops and everything goes over to digital. And that's got one big advantage, that digital obviously is much easier for us to curate and to manage. But the disadvantage, I think, and it's something that maybe we can discuss in a minute, is that where most of the communication now exists, which is by email and on discussion lists and various other media, maybe Facebook and other things, social media, where is that all going to be in 50 years' time? You know, I can go through the archive at the moment and I can find letters from Bernard Lovell in 1957 that I can read and scan and touch. What's going to happen to all our Facebook postings and BAA forum postings and emails and things in 60 years' time? You know, will they still be around for us to read? What are we going to do about that? What do we do about this whole very substantial change? So I think digital's got a lot of advantages. It means that if we're careful and we curate things properly, we can put things online. We can have an archive which is resilient and able to be searched and available for people to search from anywhere. And that's what we really want to do with the paper archive. We want to get that paper archive online as well. But I do worry really about the discussions that we're having now in astronomy in general, comets and things. Where are we going to be? Where is that archive going to be in 50, 60 years' time? Anyway, I hope you found that interesting. It went on a little bit longer than I expected. Sorry about that. But I'll open up to questions now. And Dennis, if you're around, if you can join in, and Andy will unmute you so you can get involved in the conversation too.
Hi, Dennis. I'm just about to unmute you now.
Okay.
Hey, great.
You got that?
Yep.
Yep.
I can hear you, Dennis.
Hello, Andy.
Oh, okay. Right. So there's a couple of questions. One of them is actually nothing to do with comets. It's about pictures of the ISS. Are they available for sharing? They're actually, that's from Keith Pearson. If you go on to the BAA members pages and you have a look around there, that's where I got those pictures of the ISS from. So you can find them there. A question from Jeremy Shears. What was the first comet you imaged on film and which on digital? And that's a hard one.
My first comet that I
You do
imaged,
yours.
I think, was was Comet P. Deres in 1976, I think it was, after seeing an article in Sky and Telescope by John Bortle, who said that this comet was going to be around. I'd missed Comet West in 75, but I think I tried to image periodic Comet Deres in 76, I think it was. So that was my first comet.
Mm-hmm. And can you remember your first one on CCD?
Let me think about that one, Nick. It was with Glyn Marsh, and I think that we probably took Hale Bopp.
Right. Yeah, I think my first digital images again were Hale Bopp, and I remember I had a Starlight Express parallel port CCD camera, which people these days won't kind of believe, but essentially what you had is you had a box that interfaced this camera to your PC via its parallel port. It was a remarkable thing, an amazing revelation that you could actually use a CCD. I remember, so the first time I used it, which was I think in 95, I got it late 95, or maybe 96, but just being absolutely amazed by how deep I could go. I had a 12-inch Newtonian at the time, just amazed by how deep I could go. But the problem is that you went from 35 millimeter film, which is 35 by 24 millimeter, 36 by 24 millimeter size, to this incredibly sensitive CCD, which was, I don't remember how big this SX was, but it was a few millimeters by a few millimeters. So you went from something I had a 12-inch f5 and a bit Newtonian. You went from something that had a field of view of heading on for a degree to something that had a field of view of a few arc minutes. So it was really difficult to find things. But I do remember imaging Hale Bopp, using it, and I'd been encouraged to do it by Terry Platt, who's the guy behind Starlight Express, because what he had managed to do, I think for the first time, was make movies of the shells in the inner coma of Hale Bopp. As the nucleus rotated, it was like a kind of garden sprinkler going out. So I did the same thing with my camera, and that was following Hale Bopp in the sort of last half of 96 and the early part of 97.
Yeah, I remember going to a BAA exhibition meeting at Hawkstone Hall, walking in the door and being greeted by Martin Mobley, who was waving his arms around saying, "Film is dead, film is dead," because Ron Arbor had just put a CCD image of a galaxy or something like that up on his computer screen, showing this wonderful picture with CCD, and Martin said there and then, "Film's dead." And he was right.
Well, he was sort of right. I mean, the thing was, as I say, at the beginning, for amateurs, the CCD chips were incredibly small. And it took us something like 25 years to get back to the size that we had at the beginning. So, these days, yes, you can get CMOS cameras with 35 mil full frame sensors for not a king's ransom. But it was a long time, and so we went from having a nice wide field sensor which wasn't that sensitive to a very small postage stamp sensor that was. And so and comet imaging was quite tough in those days. I mean, I remember the battle between Alan Young and Ron Arbor to be the first UK photographer to get Halley in 1985. And they finally got it within a couple of days of each other, I think, and it was about 14th magnitude, for God's sake.
Yeah. Just to sort of a comment on what you said about the recovery of Comet Halley with the 200 inch. It was actually recovered by David Jewett, I think, with the 200 inch.
That's right.
And David Jewett, of course, is a BAA member in his early days. In fact, he was a member of the lunar section until he went on to be a professional astronomer. So the man who recovered Halley in 83, 84, was a BAA member, a past BAA member at the time.
Yeah, I think we have lots of illustrious people who went on. In fact, whilst I was going through the archives for this yesterday, there are some comet reports from Ewan Whitaker. So Ewan was a very famous, again, he went the other way. He went from comets to the lunar side of things. But he was somebody who went.
Another instance you mentioned in your talk there was about Stephen James Amiri observing Halley, and
Yeah.
you actually said that he observed it visually with the naked eye, 8th magnitude. That's not quite what happened. He went up the top of Mount in Hawaii, and he used something like about a 17 or 20-inch telescope and immersed himself in pure oxygen while he observed this comet, and decided that he could see this comet at 19th magnitude through the telescope.
It's even
that
more
was the
ridiculous.
Tale.
It's even more ridiculous.
Well, according to the professionals that were there, they verified his observation because he drew the field, and sure enough, the comet was in exactly the right position. So that was Stephen James Amiri, full of oxygen. Not full of, but full of oxygen.
Right, that's kind of extreme comet observing, which I wouldn't recommend as director of the section to anybody. But the other thing that I thought was really good as I went through all of this stuff is there are lots of, as I said, lots of letters from Brian Marsden. And, you know, Brian was a really good friend of the amateur observer.
Well, you perhaps you might understand why Brian was and this is going to be a little bit lengthy, this, because Brian came from the BAA Comet section itself, because when the Comet section was formed in the 1890 by Denning, all he was interested in doing was searching for comets and their relationship with meteors. So he was interested in comets for that reason, and he wanted the BA Comet section to search for comets, and he was sort of going to give people different fields and times to search. But all that sort of died out after a while, and really when the next big name in the Comet section came into being, which was Crommelin, who eventually did the orbit for Comet Halley. He was a professional astronomer who at the Royal Observatory, and the sort of Comet section really flowed from there, because a lot of other professionals came in after Crommelin, and we ended up with people like Gerald Merton at the Cambridge observatories. And this is where Brian Marsden came in as a young boy, came in under Merton, learned his trade as a comet orbit calculator, and eventually went on to, you know, to run the Minor Planet Center. And that's why he was such a friend of the BAA, because he'd come up through the BAA, and eventually he basically ruled the astronomical world through the MPC, didn't he?
He did. But yes, I mean, and that's a good story. But again, it was very nice that he kept that connection with amateurs. You know, he could have kind of dismissed that. There's a couple of questions that have appeared. I'll just have a go at answering them. So one from Diane. Hello, Nick. What film scanner are you using to digitize the archive? So I'm using a Plus Tech. I can't read the number on it, but it's oh yes, I can. A Plus Tech 8200i. It came highly recommended from some people that had used it before. It's available on Amazon. It works very well, and it actually, even though it's relatively slow, it's got two nice features. It's got a dust removal feature that effectively relies on an infrared LED in the optics. So essentially, it doesn't remove dust by just doing a kind of algorithm that looks for dark spots, because that would eat stars. It looks for dust by actually seeing stuff that's in 3D off the surface of the film, and it removes them, and that works very well. Also, it can scan at very high resolutions, so 7,200 dpi, I think, to 16-bit TIFFs. So it allows you to get very high quality scans. And in fact, this Joe Young image that's possibly still on the screen at the moment for you, this was from a technical pan 2415 negative. I've scanned it at 7,200 dpi. So the actual, it's a 35mm negative. So the actual image is about 10,000 by 7,000, 6,000 something pixels. It's a very big image, 16-bit image. And you can actually then process that. And at some point, we're not doing it at the moment, at some point it would be good to astrometrically solve all of these plates so that we can actually index them and put them up online. But we're a long long way away from doing that. It's all a volunteer effort, and it takes a long time to do this and index things. A question from Jeremy Shears: can you give an idea of the types of research the archive will use for most fruitfully? Astrometry, image analysis? I think astrometry probably not. I would think most of the images that were taken for astrometry would have been measured at the time and probably wouldn't have been scanned, because astrometric images are deliberately underexposed so that you can actually measure the very bright central part of the comet. So probably not astrometry, but maybe the sort of physical or morphological characteristics of the comet. And of course, we have much better image processing tools now. So like this image of Hale Bopp from Joe Young, one of the things I want to do at some point is to import these into some of our modern digital image processing tools and try and bring out more of the detail than is possible through just the old style photographic printing. I think having access to notebooks and correspondence will be really interesting from a historical point of view. At the moment, part of the archive's online, but it's not indexed yet. And so it would be one of the things that would be quite good. And I need to speak to Mike Frost from the historical section, is how we get to a point where we can actually start indexing some of this stuff and making it more widely accessible. But there's lots of interesting stuff in there. I mean, I've been looking through it quite a lot over the last few days to put this stuff together, and I keep coming across stuff that it takes forever, because you keep coming across stuff and starting to read it, and you find sort of 20 minutes later you've been reading something which is not relevant to what you were looking for, but which was interesting anyway. So it's all in there. Question from Simon Street: what happened to the pre-1930s archive? I'm not sure. Richard McKim, I think, didn't mention it to me once, but I don't know. Richard McKim will be the man, and I will try and find out. In fact, I'd be interested to know what the status of the archives of other sections is in terms of pre-war material. But certainly in the Comet section, we don't have anything much before Merton in the late 30s. Dennis, I don't suppose you'd know anything about where.
No, I mean, a lot of the stuff was lost during the war, of course, and most of the stuff that was sent to Comets, the section directors at the time, tended to be looked after and responded to as though it was a sort of personal fiefdom, wasn't it? You know, and there wasn't really any thought, I don't think, to keeping stuff in a sort of regimented fashion like that we want to do today, you know.
No,
and
I think
John says a lot. John just said in the thing there that a lot of the stuff was lost in the Blitz. So, you know, that's probably the truth of the matter, isn't it?
Okay. Yes. Where are you seeing that?
I saw that as it came up on the bottom of the screen.
It's in the chat.
Chat.
Okay. How do I get that? Anyway,
I think on yours it will be near the top, Nick. And
okay.
for anyone else who's watching, just in case you're wondering, to ask a question.
Oh, I've got it. Yeah.
At the bottom on the Q&A.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just one other point actually about how the archives are managed within the BAA. So the BAA has two archivists, so Richard McKim and John Shooter, who curate the BAA's archives. And then each section director is responsible for their own archives in the BAA, but the BAA has a central storage facility where stuff can be stored. So the idea would be, I mean, certainly in the Comet section archives, what I'm trying to do is to go through the material, scan it and index it. And then once that's been done, I pass it over to Richard, who then archives it permanently in the BAA archive. So that essentially, even though the section director is responsible, ultimately, you know, the responsibility moves to the BAA, because if the section director gets run over by a bus or something else happens, you don't want the archives to disappear. The other thing which we're looking at as well at the moment, and which we discussed before Christmas with all the section directors, was getting a large amount of online digital storage, because if we are going to start scanning as we're doing in the Comet section, a lot of the photographic material and the paper material, that all needs to go online somewhere. So the BAA would have a centrally curated archive of material as well. So the idea would be to try and move away from a situation where it's the individual section director's responsibility to effectively it being a BAA responsibility, which means that hopefully stuff shouldn't disappear in future.
Lost your screen now, Nick.
Yeah, I've just put up 3 URLs.
Yep.
I don't know whether you can see those for people who are interested. So the top one is the web address of the Comet section. The middle one is the web address of our image archive. Our image archive is managed by Dennis, and at last count, we have 37,000 and something Comet images in that archive. Many of them are scans of old photographs and negatives and films. And again, I really have a debt of gratitude to Martin Mobley and to Dennis for doing that. The more recent ones are all the digital images which Dennis receives from various places all over and puts them in the correct format to go in the archive. So if you're interested in looking at any of the old Comets I've mentioned or browsing around any of those old images, go to that. And then the third one, the bottom line there, is actually a link to our scanned paper archive of letters and documents. At the moment, that is not indexed. So what you can do is just click on documents and have a random kind of read around and have a look and see what's in there. All of the old Comet section publications, the Estimerant Stella from the 70s and the newsletters from the 80s, and all of the Comet's Tales from the 90s onwards are in there. We've got, again, thanks to Martin Mobley, we have a scan of Reggie Waterfield's notebooks going back to the 1930s. And we have all the scans of the material that I've managed to scan so far. So all of the observation report forms and lots of other documents and letters too. So it's worth having a route around in there, see what you can find. But ultimately the idea would be to try and get all of these things joined together and indexed. But that's a huge, huge job.
In terms of the future scanning of the plates that we have, I've got a massive plates here which were left to me by Reggie Waterfield and Harold Ridley, which are all their Comet images that are photographed with their lenses, and they're all to be scanned into the BA Comet archive over the next year or so, as soon as we can get round to finishing them on a light table that we've got here. So they should appear in the archive, a few at a time over the next 12 months or so. And I think that's going to be quite important to have a lot of Harold Ridley's stuff on there, because there's very few images of that you can find of Harold's Comet imaging. That he did loads of Comet imaging. So I'll be pleased to get those in the archive.
Yeah, and I think it's really good to do this, because those of us these days who image comets don't really realize what it was like in the 50s, 60s and 70s. I mean, the effort just to take an image of a comet where you had to offset, guide, get everything right, so there was no chance to remove a subframe where the guiding wasn't good, and no chance to kind of do it again because you're seeing that the focus is not right on your subframes. You had to get everything right, and then at the end of the night you develop that, and that's what you got. And it was a Herculean task, and that's why really, I suppose, in the 50s and 60s there were only, in the UK, there were probably only 5 or 6 people who were doing comet imaging, high quality comet imaging, and most of those were kind of gravitated around Reggie, weren't they?
Well, yeah, I mean, there was a few people like, well, Reggie was obviously the centre of it all, but people like G.F. Kellaway, who was a photographic section director, was a comet imager, actually was a very good comet imager and recovered and nearly discovered comets of his own. So he was quite a good one. There was a few characters, Bill Granger, who used to photograph comets with a cat hanging around his neck, apparently. And you know, people like Harold, Mike Henry, who was young men at the time, who came in under Reggie, and you know, there was quite a few of Reggie's friends and colleagues who also came to take images for him when he wasn't able to, and use his observatory for that. So the BAA Comet section had quite a number of good comet observers and comet photographers. Will Hay, he was another one who did a lot of comet photography. You know, there was quite a good number of people in the comet section and the BA who were good comet imagers. People who also did image, just photographers who turned their hand to comet photography when there was a bright comet around.
Yeah. Just a couple more questions have turned up. Another one from Jeremy Shears. Can you say something about searchable metadata? Can you search on observers and years, etc.? I wish we could at the moment. So that's one of the things that we need to do. Part of the reason that this hasn't been done is I just haven't got around to discussing it with some people who can help, and I need to kind of pull my finger out on that. But yes, ideally, you know, the whole thing about an archive is that an archive isn't just 500,000 scanned documents stuck on a hard drive. It's actually all of the metadata and the indexing that makes the archive useful. And we haven't got there yet, but it's something that I would like to do. I would like to ultimately sort of draw together our image archive, our document archive, and other things, and link them together. So you could, for instance, I mean, the ideal thing, you could say, well, you know, here's an image of Comet Aaron Rowland in April 22nd, 1957. Please show me all the photographs of that day and the days before and afterwards, and any report forms, letters, or anything else that cover it. I mean, that would be ideal, but that's a huge job to do. And the first stage is really getting things scanned, I think.
Well, Nick, I mean, Jonathan was section director for 25 years. You've got 20 to go yet. I'm sure you'll get there by the end.
Well, hopefully. It's one of my objectives. Question from Malcolm Porter saying, great review of pre-digital BAA comet observations. Thank you very much. When do you plan to do the remaining history? At some point in the future, I guess, would be the answer to that. I mean, these webinars, I think, you know, at some point we're going to start getting back a little bit more to normal, and we're going to start having proper meetings again. But I hope that we actually continue the webinars in one form or another. I know it's a huge commitment from Andy and from Dominic. So we need to find a way of doing it without requiring them to commit huge amounts of time to it. But I would like that we do continue them, because I think they're really useful for people, particularly people who can't normally make it to London. And if we do that, then yes, I'll put forward a review of the digital years of the Comet section.
Here's one to maybe end up with, Nick. I've got a question which is historically related, and the historical-minded listeners might want to try this one. I want to know if anybody knows of a link between Edwin Hubble and Edwin Holmes. Yep. Now, I know that they both, Andromeda Galaxy is not the link I'm looking for.
Right.
I know that Comet Holmes was discovered near the Andromeda Galaxy, and Hubble, of course, discovered the Cepheids in the Andromeda Galaxy. But I'm looking for a different link, which may be comet related. Perhaps we can put an answer on the BA forum, and if anybody gets this right, there's a print of Comet Aaron Rowland taken by Reggie Waterfield coming your way.
Okay, that's very good. So what we'll do is we'll open that up and maybe open that as a discussion on the BAA forum, and anyone can answer that. I've just got one last question, which is actually from our Comet section CCD imaging advisor, Peter Carson, who says, are there any photographs of Comet West in the archive? And that was his first comet. And the answer is yes, there definitely are, but not as many as I would have liked. So 1975 V1, Comet West, click on the gallery. We've just got a few here. That one's rather nice. I know that there are more in our archive because I came across those Paul Doherty ones that I showed during the talk when I was looking through it the other day. So I know we have more, but we haven't got very many. But there are some, and this is actually where I got the John Rogers drawing. So before he went to be Jupiter director, he was actually drawing comets here, and this is all we have. But yeah, basically, I don't know whether you can see, hopefully you can see the screen. This is Comet West, not very many, but if you look back at Comet Aaron Rowland, we just have a huge number of Aaron Rowland prints. And in fact, the one that was used to advertise this webinar is this one by Mr. Smith, but it's my kind of idea of, I think, what makes a really nice comet picture. It's got foreground detail in it, and that just gives you a real idea of the scale of the comet. So if you've got a dull few hours over the next few weeks, just have a look around the archive, see what you can find. If you do find anything that you find particularly interesting and you've got any questions, then either put them up on the BAA forum or drop me a line. I'd be happy to answer any question you've got.
And Nick, actually along those lines, we do have a question from James Dawson on YouTube, if you've got a minute.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Which is, was there a photo of Doherty's comet, and where is it?
Okay, that's a very good. So Doherty's comet was the first comet to be photographed, and if anyone's interested in the story behind this, if you go to the BAA's meeting videos and you look up the George Alcock Memorial Lecture from last year, which I gave, called A Brief History of Comet Photography, and it starts with Doherty, because Doherty came along. It was obviously a beautiful comet, a gorgeous comet, one of the prettiest comets ever, and it was bright enough that people tried to photograph it using the new photographic process that they had. But of course, in those days, photographic materials were incredibly slow. You know, a portrait of somebody had to be taken in bright sunlight at f3.5, and they had to stand still for a minute exposure in order for them to be registered on the film. So photographing an astronomical object would be quite a challenge, but it was done, and it was done by two people, both of them called William, one called William Usherwood from Surrey, who was a photographer and who used a portrait camera. And a portrait camera is essentially a very fast camera with a short focal length for taking people's portraits. And the other was taken by William Bond, who is an American astronomer at the Harvard Observatory, who used a what size?
15-inch.
15-inch f something very large refractor, so a slow refractor. Now William Bond's picture survives, and it shows the inner coma of the comet. It was taken with a big refractor, but it just shows the inner coma of the comet. William Usherwood's picture actually showed the whole coma and part of the tail. And frustratingly, the picture doesn't seem to survive. There's lots of correspondence about it. He sent copies of it to Harvard, copies of it to the RAS, but none of those survive. And it was taken on the night before William Bond's picture. So probably the first ever photograph of a comet of Doherty by William Usherwood, unfortunately,
in England,
has been in England, in Dorking actually, is lost. If any, it may be sitting around in the bottom of a drawer somewhere in Burlington House, but I doubt it. Or somewhere in Harvard again, but I doubt it. But yes, if you're interested in that story, watch the video of my talk last year, in May last year, to the BAA. because it has.
Is that James? Was it James Dawson who asked the question?
Yes, it was. I think. Yeah.
James, I'll send you a link to a paper about that exact photograph, which is very interesting to read.
Mm. But yeah, it's a real shame that unfortunately that photograph is lost. It's sort of not quite as bad, but the photograph of the eclipse comet, 1948 eclipse comet, is also gone. And that, you know, that picture that I showed is a copy of a print of a print of a print. And Daniel Fischer in Germany, who tried to chase this down. Basically, that's a story which has been told many times and which got completely garbled. And Dan's kind of cleared up the story about exactly who was where and who took the picture of what and whatever. But still, we've not actually managed to find that original picture. And that would be a really nice picture, you know, a comet with an eclipsed sun and the corona. But yeah, unfortunately, that picture is pretty much lost as well. So yeah, the first picture ever of a comet has been lost, and I think the 1948 eclipse comet is also the only picture that we have of a bright comet and an eclipsed sun, and that's been lost as well. So that's the importance of archives.
And Nick, with the BAA community section where people post their images, we usually ask for people to sort of get in touch before they use the image, but I think linking is fine. Is there anything similar with the Comet section archive? Should they contact you if they want to use any of the images?
I mean, all of the images that are posted in the archive remain the copyright and property of the people who took them. And so it's only polite if you want to use an image anywhere that you actually ask the person who took the image. I mean, that's just normal practice, I think. If you can't find the address or you don't know the person who took it, then contact me. But it's just, you know, polite etiquette that you don't use someone else's picture without asking them. Most people would be more than happy, I think, for their pictures to be used, but you should ask and you should attribute it correctly. Obviously, that for people who are now dead, asking them is difficult, and we assume that in those cases they would be happy for their images to be used.
Thank you. If there are no more questions, I'd like to thank Nick very much for another fascinating talk. Been really enjoying your sessions on these webinars. And we had about 130 people tonight, so very good attendance.
Not bad.
Zoom and YouTube. I'll just do a quick plug for next week's webinar by sharing my screen for a moment. And so we're lucky to be joined by Professor Fraser Pearce of the University of Nottingham next week to give us a talk on adventures in the Goldilocks zone, which I'm sure will be something to do with habitable planets, exoplanets outside this solar system. Thanks again, everyone who's attended. If you missed part of this webinar or any of the other webinars, we do have them all available to view on our BAA YouTube channel, which you can also get to from the link in the top right of the BAA homepage. And thanks again to Nick and also to Dennis for joining in to make the Q&A a very interactive and interesting session.
And thank you, Andy. Thank you, Andy, for setting these up and for chairing them as well.
My pleasure. Thank you, Nick.
Okay,
and
Nick.
Hope to see you all next week.
Okay. Cheers, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.